I caught my wife cheating and invited her lover over for a Simian dinner and humiliated her in front of her parents. My name is John, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I was a happy man. I had a solid job, a nice house in the suburbs, and a beautiful wife, Olivia. We'd been married for 5 years, and I thought we were the kind of couple other people envied. We had romantic dinners, made plans for the future, and sure, we had the occasional fight, but nothing serious. From the outside looking in, our life seemed perfect. My life seemed perfect. But I guess you never really know when your world's about to fall apart. It didn't happen all at once. Olivia didn't just walk in one day and say, "Hey, I'm seeing someone else." No, it was more subtle. It started with little things. Staying late at work more often, being on her phone constantly, and walking out of the room whenever a call came in. I didn't think much of it at first. She had always been a hard worker, and life gets busy, right? But then one Saturday evening, something happened that shifted everything for me. That night, she told me she was going out with some friends, a typical girls' night out. No big deal. But as I was scrolling through social media, I saw a post from one of her best friends. It was pictures from a concert on the other side of town. The problem was, Olivia had told me she was meeting up with this very friend that night. My gut sank. That was the first time I really questioned things. The next day, I couldn't shake the suspicion. Something was off, and it was eating at me. So, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. She was in the shower, and I knew I shouldn't have, but I needed to know if I was just being paranoid. And that's when I found it. A whole hidden chat with a guy named Thomas. It wasn't just a friendly conversation either. It was intimate, flirty, full of inside jokes and plans to meet up. I felt like I was being stabbed, reading through message after message of their secret life together. And the photos. Those photos confirmed what my gut already knew. Thomas wasn't just some random friend. He was Olivia's lover. After reading those messages, I felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. I stood there, her phone in my hand, heart pounding in my chest, unable to fully process what I was seeing. This was my wife, my asterisk Olivia, talking to some other guy like I didn't even exist. Like our marriage, our entire life together, meant nothing to her. My first instinct was to storm into the bathroom and confront her right there, demand to know how long she'd been lying to me, why she did this to us. I wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything that would make the pain go away. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was that deep down, I knew an impulsive reaction wouldn't get me the answers I needed. I took a deep breath, put her phone back where I found it, and walked out of the house. I drove around for hours that day, my mind racing. Every time I thought about what I had read, the rage inside me grew. I imagined confronting her, demanding the truth, but then what? She'd probably lie, make excuses, tell me it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But those messages, they meant something. You don't hide something like that if it doesn't mean anything. So, I decided to take a different approach. I wouldn't let her see how much I knew. Not yet. I was going to bide my time and figure out exactly who this Thomas guy was. I was going to make him pay. Both of them pay. They thought they could sneak around behind my back. Treat me like a fool? Fine. I'd show them I wasn't the fool they thought I was. The first thing I did was dig deeper into the messages I had seen. I learned everything I could about Thomas, his job, where he hung out, where he lived. He wasn't anything special, just a regular guy, working a regular job. I don't know what Olivia saw in him, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that I now had a name, a face, and a plan starting to form in my head. For the next couple of weeks, I pretended like everything was fine. I acted like the clueless husband Olivia probably thought I was. But every time she went out or took one of those secretive phone calls, I tracked her moves. I started following her, discreetly of course. She was getting sloppier, meeting Thomas in public places, thinking she could get away with it because I trusted her. In reality, I was collecting every piece of evidence I could, playing the part of the doting husband, while inside, I was seething. I had no idea how deep this thing went, but I was going to find out. And once I had everything I needed, I'd make sure they both regretted ever thinking they could make a fool out of me. The more I dug into Olivia's secret life, the angrier I got. But at the same time, I became more focused. The rage turned into something sharper, more controlled. I wasn't going to be some guy who just confronted his cheating wife and watched her cry, then begged for forgiveness. No! That wasn't going to be enough for me. I needed them both to feel the weight of their betrayal, and I was going to make sure they did. Every time Olivia left the house, I was on edge, but I couldn't let her see it. I had to play it cool. I had to keep pretending, which was the hardest part. I'd kiss her goodbye, ask about her day like nothing had changed. Inside, though, I was counting the hours until I could make my move. Meanwhile, I started learning more about Thomas. I followed him a few times, figured out where he hung out after work. He liked going to this bar downtown, some dive where he could meet up with his buddies. It was the perfect place to casually bump into him. I needed to get close to him, make him think I was just some random guy who'd become a friendly face in his world. One Friday night, I went to the bar and waited. Sure enough, Thomas showed up, looking relaxed and completely unaware that his lover's husband was sitting just a few seats away. After a while, I struck up a conversation, played it cool, introduced myself as if I was just some guy enjoying a beer. He had no idea who I was, and I could tell he didn't suspect a thing. We talked about the usual stuff, work, sports, and life. I kept it light, all the while gritting my teeth, knowing this was a man who had been sneaking around with my wife. And then he started talking about her. Not by name, of course, but he mentioned having this secret relationship with a married woman. He laughed about how exciting it was, sneaking around, fooling the husband. My blood was boiling, but I kept smiling, nodding along like I didn't have a clue. I wanted to punch him right there, but I had to stay calm. This was all part of the plan. After a few more drinks, we exchanged numbers. I told him we should hang out again sometime, and he agreed. Just like that, I was in. He thought I was his new buddy, and that was exactly what I wanted. Now, all I needed was the perfect opportunity to set everything in motion. The more I got to know Thomas, the more I realized how easy it was going to be. He wasn't particularly smart, just cocky. He thought he was untouchable, like this affair made him some kind of winner. I knew better. After that night at the bar, everything started falling into place. Thomas was clueless, completely unaware of who I really was or what I had planned for him. He probably thought he was getting away with it, that he'd keep seeing Olivia in secret without me ever finding out. But little did he know, I was already 3 steps ahead of him. The next few weeks were all about patience. I had to make sure everything lined up perfectly before I could execute my plan. I spent more time hanging out with Thomas, playing the role of his new buddy. Meanwhile, I was keeping close tabs on Olivia. Every time she left to work late or meet friends, I knew exactly where she was going. She thought she was so clever, but she didn't know I had access to her location through her phone. Every time she snuck off to see Thomas, I knew. I tracked every lie, every move, and with each one, my resolve grew stronger. The time was coming, and I needed everything to be perfect. That's when I came up with the idea for the dinner. Thomas and I had gotten close enough that inviting him over for dinner seemed natural. He didn't hesitate when I brought it up one night after a few beers. "You should come over for dinner," I said casually. "Meet my wife and her parents. They'd love to meet you." I could see the momentary hesitation on his face, but it quickly vanished when I assured him it was no big deal. He didn't have the slightest clue what he was walking into. He thought it was just a friendly invitation. I almost laughed thinking about how clueless he was. As for Olivia, when I told her I had invited a new friend over for dinner, her reaction was exactly what I expected. Her face went pale for a split second when I mentioned his name, but she quickly covered it up, pretending everything was fine. She probably thought she could handle it, that she could keep up the charade and play along. But I knew better. I could see the panic in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it. And her parents? They were going to be the final piece of the puzzle. Olivia's parents had always treated me like a son. They were good people, respectable, wealthy, and completely unaware of what their daughter had been doing behind closed doors. I knew they'd be at the dinner, and I knew exactly how much this would devastate them. So, I started preparing for the night. Everything had to be just right. The table was set, the wine was chilled. It would be a dinner none of them would ever forget. Olivia thought she could control the situation, that she could keep her dirty secret hidden. Thomas thought he was just coming over for a meal with a friend. And her parents, well, they were about to learn the truth about their darling daughter. I could barely contain myself, knowing what was about to unfold. My plan was finally coming together. The day of the dinner finally arrived. I had been playing this twisted game for weeks, carefully pulling the strings behind the scenes, and now everything was set. The house was spotless, the table laid out with our best china, candles lit just right. To anyone walking in, it would seem like an ordinary, pleasant family dinner. But I knew better. I knew what was really about to go down. Olivia was nervous. I could tell by the way she was pacing around the house, trying to make everything perfect. She hadn't said much about the dinner, just that she was looking forward to meeting my new friend, but there was an edge to her voice, like she was bracing herself for something she couldn't quite figure out. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Her parents arrived first, dressed sharp and full of their usual warmth. I shook hands with her father, exchanged pleasantries with her mother, all while keeping the growing tension inside me at bay. They had no idea what was about to happen. They still saw me as their loyal, loving son-in-law. But I wasn't that guy anymore, not after what I knew. Then, just as everything was falling into place, the doorbell rang. I could feel Olivia tense up beside me, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced at me, her eyes wide with the panic she was trying so hard to hide. "I'll get it," I said, calmly walking to the door. I opened it, and there he was, Thomas, standing on my doorstep with a stupid grin on his face, holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. "Hey, man. Thanks for the invite," he said, completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. "Glad you could make it," I replied, my voice steady. I stepped aside to let him in, and I could feel Olivia's eyes burning into me from across the room. Thomas walked in like he owned the place, flashing that cocky smile that made my blood boil. I introduced him to Olivia's parents, who, of course, welcomed him like they would any of my friends. Olivia kept her distance, her face pale, barely managing a forced smile as she greeted him. I could tell she was barely holding it together, trying to figure out how much I knew, how this could all play out. She had no idea how far I was willing to take this. As we all sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily, too easily. Olivia's parents were completely in the dark, laughing, sharing stories, unaware of the ticking time bomb sitting at the table with them. Thomas, oblivious of the tension between me and Olivia, was charming them like he had no care in the world. Olivia, meanwhile, was practically silent, picking at her food, her eyes darting between me and Thomas like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept playing the good host, making small talk, pouring wine, all the while enjoying the quiet storm brewing under the surface. They had no idea what was coming, and I savored that moment, the calm before everything came crashing down. As dinner went on, I could feel the weight of the evening building. I knew exactly when I was going to drop the bomb, and I was relishing every second leading up to it. Thomas kept talking like he was in some kind of sitcom, laughing with Olivia's dad, making jokes about life and work. Every word out of his mouth made me hate him more, but I kept it cool. This wasn't the time for outbursts or losing control. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to mess it up by acting too soon. I watched Olivia, watched the way her hands trembled every time she reached for her glass, the way she barely touched her food. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. She didn't know how much I knew, and that gave me all the power. Olivia excused herself to the kitchen at one point, probably needing a moment to catch her breath. I followed her in a few minutes later. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was standing by the sink, her back to me, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. "You okay?" I asked, my voice casual, like I didn't already know what was eating at her. She jumped slightly, then turned to face me, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a little overwhelmed, I guess," she said, her voice shaky. I could see the panic in her eyes, the fear that everything was about to come crashing down. And she was right. It was. "Well, don't worry," I said, smiling as I walked closer. "The night's almost over." She nodded, looking like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart right there in front of me. She had no idea how bad things were about to get. We went back to the dining room, and I could see Thomas getting more comfortable, chatting up Olivia's dad about some business venture he was involved in. He was really laying it on thick, trying to impress her parents. It was almost laughable, really. Here he was, sitting at my table, thinking he was safe, thinking no one knew about his dirty little secret. The longer he talked, the more I could feel the anticipation building inside me. Olivia barely said a word the rest of the evening. She just kept glancing at me and Thomas, probably wondering when, or if, I was going to blow the whole thing up. I could see her trying to keep her composure, but it was slipping, and I loved every second of it. Finally, dessert was served, and I knew it was time. I had waited long enough. I poured everyone a fresh glass of wine, making sure to fill Thomas's a little more than the others. He didn't seem to notice, too busy playing the charming guest. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, and then I stood up, raising my glass for a toast. "I just want to say how glad I am that we could all come together tonight," I began, looking around the table. Thomas raised his glass, smiling like the idiot he was. Olivia's parents smiled warmly, clearly having enjoyed the evening. Olivia, on the other hand, was pale, her hands trembling as she reached for her glass. "In this family," I continued, locking eyes with Thomas, "we believe in being honest with each other. And I think tonight is the perfect time to reveal some truths." Olivia's eyes widened, and I could feel the entire room shift. The warmth and laughter that had filled the air just minutes before were gone. A thick silence fell over the table as everyone stared at me, waiting to see what I would say next. I turned to Thomas, who was now looking a little uneasy, his smile fading. "Thomas, you've become a good friend of mine these past few weeks. I really appreciated getting to know you. And you've gotten pretty close to Olivia too, haven't you?" His face went blank, the color draining from it. Olivia's parents looked confused, not understanding what was happening yet. Olivia, though, looked like she was about to pass out. I smiled, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone just how close you've gotten?" The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone's eyes were on Thomas, and you could see the panic slowly building behind his eyes. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, completely blindsided. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Olivia, sitting across from him, looked like she was on the verge of collapse, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she could somehow stop what was happening. I leaned in just a little, still smiling, and said, "Come on, Thomas. You've told me all about your secret relationship. Why don't you share it with the rest of us?" Thomas's face flushed, and he tried to laugh it off, glancing nervously at Olivia's parents, who still looked confused but were starting to pick up on the tension. John, I think you've got the wrong idea, man," Thomas stammered, his voice shaky. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly scrambling for an out, but there wasn't one. "No, I don't think I do," I said calmly, my eyes never leaving his. "You see, I've been watching you, Thomas. Watching you and Olivia." At that, Olivia's mother let out a sharp breath, and her father sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as the reality of the situation began to set in. Olivia was frozen, her eyes glued to the table, refusing to look up, refusing to face the fallout that was coming. Thomas was fidgeting now, his face turning red as he realized the gravity of the situation. He glanced at Olivia, hoping for some sort of rescue, but she couldn't even look at him. "I think it's time to come clean, don't you?" I continued, my voice cool and measured, as I turned to Olivia. "Why don't you tell your parents what's really been going on?" Olivia looked like she might be sick. Her lips trembled as she finally raised her head and looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "John, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do this." But it was too late for that. I wasn't going to back down now. I had been waiting for this moment, and there was no way I was letting her or Thomas weasel their way out of it. I stood up, letting the full weight of the situation settle over the table. Olivia's parents were staring at their daughter, shocked and waiting for an explanation. Thomas looked like he was about to bolt out the door, but he was too stunned to move. I turned to Olivia's father, who had always respected me, always treated me like a son. "Mr. Davenport, I think it's time you knew what your daughter and Thomas have been hiding." His eyes went wide as he slowly turned to Olivia. "What's he talking about, Olivia?" The entire room held its breath. Olivia's mother gasped, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes bouncing between her daughter and me, trying to make sense of it all. Olivia, shaking, finally broke down. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible as tears spilled down her cheeks. I've been seeing Thomas. We've been having an affair." Her father's face turned to stone, his jaw clenched in fury, while her mother just looked heartbroken, as if the weight of her daughter's betrayal was too much to bear. I watched it all unfold, the chaos I had carefully planned now playing out before me. The shock, the devastation. This was what they deserved. Olivia, for lying to me, for betraying everything we had built together. Thomas, for thinking he could sneak around behind my back, for thinking he could ruin my life without consequences. I leaned back in my chair, the rage in my chest slowly fading into satisfaction as I watched them all crumble. "Now you understand who you've been dealing with," I said, my voice cold, directed at Thomas. He didn't say a word, just sat there, staring down at his plate like a scolded child, completely defeated. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, a sharp reminder of just how long the moment stretched. Olivia's confession hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I could see the devastation in her parents' eyes. Her mother looked like she might break down any second, her hand trembling as she wiped away a tear. Olivia's father just stared at her, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Thomas, on the other hand, sat there completely still, looking like he was about to be sick. He hadn't said a word since the truth came out, his usual cocky smile wiped clean off his face. For the first time since I met him, he looked small, pathetic even, and it took everything in me not to laugh at the sight of him. Olivia tried to say something, to salvage whatever she could, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "Mom, Dad, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was confused. It didn't mean anything, I swear. Didn't mean anything." Her father's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. He slammed his hand down on the table, making Olivia flinch. "How dare you say that? How could you do this, Olivia? How could you betray your husband like this? Betray us?" Olivia's mother was openly crying now, her body shaking with every sob. "Olivia, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice broken. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, watching as the fallout played out exactly how I'd imagined it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the lies, the deceit, and how deep it went. Olivia wasn't just ruining our marriage. She was tearing apart her family, too. Thomas, finally finding his voice, tried to stammer out some pathetic defense. "Mr. Davenport, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear Shut up." Olivia's father snapped, his voice seething with rage. "You think you can walk into our lives, sit at our table and play these games? You think you can just say sorry and everything will be fine? Get out. Get the hell out of my house. Thomas froze, glancing between me and Olivia, like he was hoping someone would step in and save him. But no one was going to. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. I watched him slowly rise from his chair, fumbling with his jacket as he mumbled something under his breath, his face pale and his hands shaking. He tried to apologize again, but Olivia's father wasn't having it. I don't ever want to see your face again. You hear me? If I see you anywhere near my daughter or my family again, you'll regret it. Without another word, Thomas turned and hurried out the door, slamming it behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. I stayed seated, watching Olivia. She hadn't moved since her confession, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her parents were shattered, her father pacing back and forth, her mother still sobbing quietly. The weight of what she'd done was finally sinking in for her, and I knew this was just the beginning of her punishment. I stood up, slowly, and walked over to where Olivia sat. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, her face wet with tears. "John, please. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I stared down at her, the woman I had once loved, the woman who had destroyed everything. I felt nothing but cold detachment. A mistake? You didn't mean for it to go this far. I echoed, my voice low and steady. You've been lying to me for months. How many lies did you tell, Olivia? How many times did you sneak out, thinking you'd never get caught? She sobbed harder, unable to look at me. I know I messed up, but I love you, John. I do. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. We can work through this. I laughed, an empty, bitter sound that made her flinch. Work through this? There's nothing left to work through, Olivia. You've already destroyed it all. Her father turned toward me, his voice rough. John, what happens next? I paused, letting the silence speak for itself for a moment. Then I answered, my voice cold and final. What happens next? Olivia and I are done. There's no coming back from this. Her mother let out a choked sob, and Olivia broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. But I didn't feel anything. Not pity, not sadness, not even anger anymore. Just a cold satisfaction of knowing I had set everything in motion, and that it was all falling apart exactly the way I wanted. Her father stepped forward, asking, "Is there no way to fix this?" I could see the hope in his eyes, but there was no fixing what she had destroyed. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said firmly, watching the realization hit them all. Olivia's sobs grew louder as I packed my things, her cries echoing through the house, but I blocked it out. I needed to get away from her, from everything we once had. By the time I finished, the house was quiet. Olivia's parents sat, devastated, while she remained in the corner broken. I said nothing to her. There was nothing left to say. Shaking her father's hand, I told him, "This isn't your fault," before walking out the door, leaving behind a life I thought I knew. Leaving that house felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into an unfamiliar reality. I had always imagined that if something like this happened, I'd feel broken, shattered by the betrayal. But instead, there was this strange calm inside me. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't even angry anymore. It was just done. I spent the next few days in a hotel, thinking about how everything had unraveled so quickly. There was a small part of me that wanted to be furious, that wanted to let the rage take over, but it never came. Instead, I found myself feeling almost numb. Maybe it was because I had seen this coming. Maybe because I had been ready for this moment long, before I set my plan in motion. Olivia tried to contact me, of course. Texts, missed calls. Everything from desperate pleas to apologies that felt empty. I didn't respond. I didn't see the point. Her words meant nothing to me now. She had made her choices, and this was the price she had to pay. As for Thomas, he vanished. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he quit his job and left town soon after the dinner. I wasn't surprised. Once the truth came out, He had no place in our lives anymore. He probably thought he could escape the consequences by running away. But I knew better. He'd have to live with what he'd done, just like Olivia. Olivia's parents reached out to me, too. They were devastated, of course, angry at their daughter, embarrassed by the mess she created. They offered support, telling me they'd always be there for me no matter what happened. But I told them I needed time. I didn't want to drag them into this any more than they already had been. It wasn't their fault. Olivia's actions were her own. I hired a lawyer, and the divorce process moved quickly. Olivia didn't fight it. She knew she couldn't. The marriage was over, and there was nothing left to argue about. I wanted nothing from her, not the house, not the possessions, nothing. I just wanted out. I think that shocked her, maybe even hurt her. But what did she expect? After everything she did, there was no going back. The paperwork was filed, and within a few months, it was finalized. Just like that, 5 years of marriage reduced to a stack of documents and a signature. No grand ending, no dramatic final confrontation, just a quiet closure I needed. After leaving the house, I stayed at a hotel for a few days. Olivia tried calling and texting, apologizing, begging for a second chance, but I didn't respond. What was the point? She had made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. I found out Thomas quit his job and left town shortly after the dinner. He didn't want to face the fallout, but running away wouldn't change what he'd done. Olivia's parents reached out to offer support, devastated by her actions. But I needed distance from everyone involved. It wasn't their fault, but I wasn't going to drag them into this mess any further. The divorce process was quick and clean. Olivia didn't fight it. She knew she couldn't. I wanted nothing from her, just freedom. Within a few months, it was all over. 5 years of marriage reduced to a signature and some paperwork. After the divorce, I packed up and left town. I needed a fresh start, away from the memories of the life I thought I had. It's been over a year now since the divorce, and life feels normal again. Maybe even better than normal. I'm in a new city, surrounded by people who don't know anything about my past, who don't see me as the guy whose wife cheated on him. I've been able to build something new, something that belongs entirely to me.